The second lesson is taken from the Gospel of Luke, the 9th chapter. To everyone, Jesus said, anyone who wants to be a follower of mine must renounce self. Day after day he must take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to secure his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. What does anyone gain by winning the whole world at the cost of destroying himself? It's quite incredible how much of life is a matter of promises. I, Carl, take thee Elizabeth, and I do promise. I do solemnly swear to tell the whole truth. If I am elected, I promise. On my honor, I will do my duty. Mr. and Mrs. Bowen are happy to accept the invitation. I pledge allegiance to the flag and to the country. Do you promise independence upon God to rear this child? I promise, Mommy, I'll never do it again. We mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. In a world of economics, every mortgage, contract, sale of stock, purchase of goods has some implied promise behind it. Every ad on television or in the newspaper is promising something. In our personal lives, neighborhood, church, friendship circle, everything depends upon promises made and kept. In fact, our Western civilization is built of promises, and its future always depends upon the quality and strength of those promises. And its origin lies in an old faith and culture which made promises and pledges, covenant and commitment, a way of life. The astounding thing about this old story is the role assigned to freely given choice and decision. The land of Pharaoh, the powers of Mesopotamia, never said, choose here and now. They ordered and you obeyed or suffered the consequences. But here's Joshua standing on the edge of the promised land saying to his people, make up your own mind. As for me and my family, the remarkable thing about Jesus is his refusal to compel, to coerce. If you will hear my voice, if you would be healed, if anyone wants to be a follower of mine, as if everything depended upon intelligent and free assent. I'm afraid over the years the church always has a tendency to forget this, coercing either by state power or what I would call emotional imperialism, anything to get the greatest number on board. And the result has often been either uncommitted constituencies or disillusioned individuals. Mark Twain writes of the revival, the fall revival down in Hannibal, Missouri. Missed the tent meetings this fall because of flu, and all my friends got converted except me. 1 month later now, and everyone is back to normal. Clearly, though, our faith sees life as residing in promises freely made and fully lived. But there is another enemy of such a view of life out there in contemporary society, and that is the pervasive view that real life consists in responding to one's feelings. When was the last time you heard a television journalist ask someone what they thought? The prevailing question now is, how did you feel? Or how do you feel? Altogether too many think of life as a matter of following desire, doing what comes naturally, and what is supremely important is whether I feel good or not. In our therapeutic society, the emotional life of the individual is seen as primary and as the guide as to how we should act. So long-term commitments to place or person or purpose are seen very often as threats to individuality, to our own self-fulfillment, constrictions upon our own pleasures, destructive of real life. Hence, I suspect the lack of loyalty in our time to institutions, the inability to make the marriage and family commitment, let alone keep it, unwillingness to get involved in larger purposes than oneself. In contrast to this increasing mood and attitude stand the words of Jesus that real life comes of commitments beyond comfort, choosing of a way in which we lose ourselves rather than nurse and pamper. The Ten Commandments are not prefaced with, if you are in the mood. Life primarily for yourself, your comfort, your security, your pleasure, Jesus says, is life that inevitably leads to the destruction of the self. Only promises, freely given and fully lived, create a sense of the self which is worth living with. Create, first of all, a sense of place. And I fear we've lost that as well. I don't mean we ought never to move. Most of us have moved many times in our lives. The demands of career and stages of life often call for it. The question is whether we settle down and in when we do move. I'm told that there are nurseries that have discovered something about preparing their trees for transplant to your front yard. They move them around in their own yard because they've discovered that then instead of sending down deep tap roots into the soil, they develop a cluster of lesser roots, thus making it easier for them to be uprooted and moved when sold. And I suspect that's a pretty good picture of what has happened to a lot of people in our time. Lack of commitment to place is not just a problem for these who move about all the time, but it becomes a problem for us all. Because if on your block all 7 of your neighbors move, even though you don't, your place has changed. Sue Wonder writes, "It's good to visit other places, but as a way of life, I find I must root well to one. And so I'm glad to be home again, where my own cows move in real time." She's a farmer. Move in real time across a familiar canvas of sun and shade. Beyond them lies the topography of the farm, familiar as my own hand, every acre textured by the memory of some event or experience, the first sign of a new season, the last signs of an old. It takes time to know a place deeply, to develop ties that bind without confining, and perhaps it takes a journey now and then to bring one back home. At least I found it so. Ahmed Badawi is a bus driver and long a dear friend now. He lives in Nazareth. His family settled there out of the desert 140 years ago, and he would never think of living anywhere else. He loves his extended family and community, is politically engaged, committed to its life and future, very involved right now to trying to create peace in the midst of the recent controversies in Nazareth, which you may have read about. I was riding with his 19-year-old son from Nazareth to Tiberias the other day, and I casually asked if he would ever like to move to America. And he smiled and said, "No, my father has taught me to love our place." And I'm sure his children and his grandchildren will stay in that place. To follow Jesus does not mean a life of wandering, sitting loose to the responsibilities and commitments of place. Quite the contrary. He himself went deep rather than wide, never traveled more than 50 miles from home in his whole life. It means commitment to place because without that it is exceedingly difficult, exceedingly hard to know commitment to real people, beyond one's own agenda, giving oneself to real relationships. And I do worry that the landscape of life in our time has become so shifting and transient that many people are bereft of real friendships there to support and care in times of need. It's a dangerous existence when a man or a woman becomes isolated, feels alone. One commentator describes the scene this way: people like my parents lived in a real society, were members of a community, had a circle of friends that extended back through the years. A great many of these young apartment and condo couples do not live in a society and are not members of a community. They are young people eating and sleeping and trying to enjoy themselves with no interest in or feeling of responsibility for a certain people and a certain place. But there is something thin, brittle about their lives. It lacks richness, roots, human depth, sap, juice. They are more or less camping out. Family is a creation of promises freely made and fully lived, beyond our own safety and security and comfort and pleasure, is it not? There's a marvelous moment in Thornton Wilder's play, The Skin of Our Teeth, where the character Mrs. Atribus says to her husband, calmly, with a little bit of drama in her voice, "I didn't marry you because you're perfect. I married you because you gave me a promise." And she takes off her ring and looks at it. The promise has made up for your faults. And the promise I gave you has made up for mine as well. Two imperfect people get married, and it is the promise that makes the marriage. And so it always is. Marriage is not something we fall into or fall out of. It's something that we create between us out of promises, commitment before God and the neighbors that we seek and struggle to maintain. And without that unqualified promise, for richer, for poorer, fatter or skinnier, real marriage rarely happens. I read a story a while ago about a couple who'd gone together for many, many years, but nothing seemed to materialize. He was very shy, unable to express his feelings. He seemed paralyzed before the idea of making a commitment. So, although she went along with their casual relationship, she'd pretty much given up. But he finally really did fall in love with her, and finally one day his emotions got the best of him. He was no longer in control. Without knowing what he was saying, he said, "Why don't we get married?" She threw up her arms and said, "It's a wonderful idea, but who in the world would have us?" Marriage, family, real family, is a thing of promises freely made and fully lived. Giving birth to a child is a biological act. Having children is a promise to them and to our God, a promise to give up a significant measure of our own self-centeredness and comfort in order that they may grow and thrive. And is not the problem today the fact that too many are giving birth to children without promising to parent them, really, nurture, train them, give them all they need to grow healthy and whole? That's one meaning of baptism. Parents stand up here Sunday after Sunday and do what? They promise to be parents, as if they have any choice. But that's precisely the point. They do have a choice. And if they don't make it, if they say, let the kids manage on their own, you know the result, the consequences. The late Irma Bombeck, I think, catches the spirit of promise in parenthood. She writes, "Raising a family wasn't something I put on my resume. But I have to ask myself, would I apply for the same job again? It was hard work. It was a lot of crud detail. It was steady. Lord, was it steady. But in retrospect, no matter what deeds my life did yield, how many books I had written that marched in a row on the library shelf, no matter how many printed words of mine dangled under the magnets on refrigerator doors across the country, I had done something rather extraordinary with my life as a mother. For 3 decades, I had been a matriarch of my own family, bonding them together, waiting for stragglers to grow up, catch up, make up, mending verbal fences, adding a little glue for cohesion here, patching up a few harsh exchanges there, and daily dispensing a potion of loyalty to something bigger than all of us. My husband found me sitting in the living room one evening and asked, "What are you doing sitting here all alone in the dark?" "Thinking about this weekend." "They're good kids," he said reassuringly as he sat beside me. I put my head on his shoulder. The room was getting chilly. A car went by. Its lights illuminated the room, then threw it again into darkness. I thought about the kids again and hoped with all my heart that they would someday aspire, as I did, to the dream of a family of their own and a living room that no one ever sat in. No less than family, our friendship and real community, the product of promises freely given and fully lived. They call, all of these do, for the willingness to transcend ourselves in commitment to others. The willingness to lose our lives in order to find them. And then church is a creation of promises, freely made and fully lived toward one another. At least it was that way for the early church. It did not come ready-made with creeds and committees, cathedrals and curriculum. If the church had begun as a committee, I doubt very much it would have made it for a week. It was simple folk who, following the call of their Lord, said, "We'll be here for one another," and who kept their promise. Or, stop to think of it, we would not be here this morning. And what did our forebears do when they hit these shores? You can read their promise in stone at the west exit of the narthex, the Mayflower Compact, a covenant freely entered into, a promise that they gave to one another, to be there for God and each other in a tough new land. And this congregation exists because of promises 12 families made to each other 107 years ago, promises they kept. And this congregation exists because of the promises that you make year in and year out and keep so faithfully. Promises not just about financial support, but of presence and participation, the gift of yourself to one another. By the way, I heard recently of a small church in the city that called the police to report in great panic the theft of pledges in the amount of $30,000. By the way, this stole comes from Jerusalem, from Sammy Barzan again. And finally, I have the green that I'm supposed to wear in this season of the church year. But you know, I thought it rather appropriate that I should inaugurate it on Loyalty Sunday. Green. But it is pledges that make church possible. There will always be hangers-on, what we in the trade call the hatched, matched, and dispatched crowd. And we'll be there for them as well until, pray God, they sense deeper needs. But it is the loyal crowd like you all who make your promise to this very human fellowship and who live it out year in, year out. It is you who make church possible. Not just for yourselves, but also for those who come here hurting and in need, and for those who are coming after, for our children and our grandchildren. A few winters ago, the weather was particularly severe up in Minnesota. I have lived there and I know what it can be. According to a report in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, the temperatures one Sunday were 20 to 35 below zero, and the wind chill factor about 50 below. And so Sunday morning attendance, according to the article, at Brooklyn United Methodist Church in the Minneapolis suburb of Brooklyn Park was rather skimpy, with one side of the church almost empty, saying no one wanted to face the frigid, icy wind that whipped outside. But the article goes on to say that there among the scattered worshipers who had braved the elements was 88-year-old Goldie Schreiber. She had driven to church that morning after picking up Anna Hamilton, who turned 100 in October, and they sat with their 94-year-old friend, Fran Sparks, who met them as usual for the 9 o'clock service. And the journalist concludes, this is the kind of loyalty that has kept that church alive for 130 years. And you know, it's really that kind of loyalty that keeps all churches alive. Each one of the 5 churches that I have served over these 43 years in the ministry has had at its heart a sturdy band of promise keepers. So life is a thing of promises. And the good news, according to Jesus, is this. It is in making and keeping our promises that we do finally learn the real life, the only life worth living. Louis Schmedes, retired professor out in California, who grew up on the streets of my hometown at the same time I did, says it quite eloquently. He writes, "To make a promise and keep it is one of the most powerful moments in a person's life. Imagine what life would be like if you could never get from a friend or spouse, if all you ever could get from a friend or spouse were this: I'll be there if I can, but don't count on it. Without promises made and kept, we all go crazy and life together is a mess. Everything good in human relationships depends on whether we dare enough to make a promise and care enough to try and keep it. When you make a promise to another person, you reach out into an unpredictable future and you make one thing predictable. You will be there. Even if being there costs you something, you will be there. With a single word of promise, you create an island of certainty in a raging sea of uncertainty. You decide not to let your life be knocked around by unconscious drives and uncontrollable impulses and desires. Our lives together work right when we make promises that we mean to keep. We need to learn again that cutting deals is not what makes life good. What makes life good is the power to make promises and keep the promises we make. When you make and keep a promise, you are as much like God as you will ever get to be. Indeed, we can only make our promises because of another promise in which we've learned to put our trust. God's promise in Jesus of Nazareth to be there for us and with us, no matter what. Granting us, when we falter and fail, forgiveness, granting us the strength to get up and go on, knowing that He's with us always, even to the end of the world. If anyone would follow me, means above all that we do not walk alone. And now